A heated confrontation erupts at a busy gas station when Claire, a fiery, socially conscious woman advocating for eco-friendly fuel alternatives, inadvertently insults Tom, a humble, decorated war veteran struggling to refuel his beat-up truck. Tensions flare as bystanders watch, polarized by their opposing ideals. But when Tom's devastating secret surfaces and Claire's shocking act of redemption unfolds, the scene takes a heart-wrenching turn no one saw coming. The gas station buzzed with the usual hum of activity. Cars pulled up, engines idling as drivers filled their tanks. Among them was Claire, a young woman in her late 20s, whose sharp features matched her equally sharp tongue. Her electric car glided silently into the station, a stark contrast to the noisy, gas-guzzling vehicles surrounding her. Claire prided herself on her eco-conscious lifestyle and her ability to speak her mind, sometimes too much. As Claire stepped out of her car, the smell of gasoline assaulted her senses. Wrinkling her nose, she glanced at the vehicle beside her, a battered old pickup truck that looked like it had survived a war. Its faded green paint was chipped and peeling, and the exhaust pipe coughed out thick black smoke with every sputter of the engine. The man standing beside it, Tom, was trying to coax the nozzle of the pump into the truck's tank. He was in his 60s, his face weathered and his hands trembling slightly as he fumbled with the pump. Claire watched for a moment, her irritation mounting. She hated the sight of old, inefficient vehicles like that truck, relics of a time when environmental concerns were an afterthought. Finally, she couldn't hold her tongue. "Are you seriously still driving that thing?" Claire said, loud enough for Tom to hear. "Do you have any idea how much pollution that's putting into the air?" Tom turned slowly, his gray eyes meeting hers. He wore a worn military jacket adorned with faded patches, and his posture was stiff, almost defensive. "It gets me where I need to go," he replied evenly, his voice gravelly but calm. "Yeah, and it's killing the planet while you're at it," Claire shot back. Her voice carried a mix of frustration and superiority. "Ever heard of upgrading? Maybe something that doesn't destroy the environment?" Tom straightened, his hands still gripping the pump. "Not everyone has the luxury of affording a fancy electric car," he said. "This truck's old, sure, but it's all I've got." By now, a few heads had turned. Other drivers paused in their tasks, their curiosity piqued by the rising tension. Some pulled out their phones, ready to record what was shaping up to be an interesting showdown. "Well, maybe you should think about walking if you can't afford something better," Claire retorted. "At least that won't choke the rest of us with fumes." Tom's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked back at his truck, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he said, "This truck's more than just a vehicle to me. You don't know my story, so maybe you should keep your judgments to yourself." Claire scoffed. "Oh, please, don't play the victim card. Everyone's got a sob story. That doesn't give you a free pass to poison the air for the rest of us." Tom's grip on the pump tightened, his knuckles whitening. "You don't know a damn thing about me," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. "I've been through more than you can imagine. So, unless you're here to help, I suggest you move along." The crowd around them grew, a mix of sympathy and annoyance evident on their faces. Some sided with Claire, nodding in agreement with her environmental stance. Others muttered about respecting one's elders, especially a man who was clearly a veteran. Claire, however, was too caught up in her own righteousness to notice the divide. "Look, I'm just saying there are better options," she continued. "If we all did our part, maybe this planet wouldn't be in such a mess. And if you learned to show a little respect, maybe the world wouldn't be in such a mess either," Tom shot back, his calm demeanor finally cracking. His voice was louder now, filled with a quiet fury that silenced Claire for a moment. The crowd murmured, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Claire hesitated, her confidence wavering. But before she could respond, Tom continued. "Yeah, you think you've got it all figured out because you drive an electric car?" he said. "You have no idea what it's like to struggle, to make do with what little you have. This truck isn't just a way to get around. It's a part of my life, a part of my past." Claire crossed her arms, trying to maintain her composure. "And what's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her tone less sharp but still defensive. Tom didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed the pump back in its holder and turned to face her fully. The weariness in his eyes was unmistakable, and for the first time, Claire noticed the scars on his hands and the slight limp in his walk. "It means you don't know what you're talking about," he said simply. Then, without another word, he climbed back into his truck and started the engine. The truck roared to life, its exhaust pipes spewing more smoke into the air. Claire watched as he drove away, her chest tight with a mix of frustration and something she couldn't quite identify. Around her, the crowd began to disperse, the excitement of the confrontation fading. But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she had missed something important, something she couldn't understand. As she climbed back into her car, the smell of gasoline still lingering in the air, Claire found herself staring at the spot where the old truck had been. For the first time, she wondered if there was more to Tom's story than she had assumed. And for the first time, she felt a flicker of doubt about whether she had been right to confront him at all. The confrontation lingered in Claire's mind long after she left the gas station. That night, she tossed and turned, replaying the scene in her head. Tom's parting words unsettled her. She had always been quick to judge, confident in her beliefs, and vocal about her values. Yet Tom's worn face and the sadness in his voice haunted her. She hated to admit it, but his words had planted a seed of doubt. The next day, Claire found herself scrolling through social media, looking for anything that might explain who Tom was. She searched hashtags, local pages, and forums, but found nothing. It was as if Tom didn't exist online, and his absence only deepened her curiosity. Who was he? What did he mean when he said the truck was part of his past? Unable to let it go, Claire returned to the gas station, her nerves buzzing. She scanned the parking lot, hoping to spot Tom's old green truck, but it was nowhere to be found. Frustrated, she went inside to speak to the attendant behind the counter. "Hi," Claire began, feeling awkward. "I'm looking for an older man with a green pickup truck. He was here yesterday." The attendant looked up from his phone, studying her curiously. "Yeah, I know him. Drives that old beater, right? Comes here all the time." "That's him," Claire said quickly. "Do you know where he lives?" The attendant raised an eyebrow. "Why are you looking for him?" Claire hesitated. I think I owe him an apology." The attendant shrugged. "He lives in that trailer park down by the river, but I don't know if he'll want visitors." Claire thanked him and left, her heart pounding as she got into her car. She wasn't sure why she was doing this. Guilt, curiosity, or something else entirely, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to know more about Tom. The drive to the trailer park felt longer than it was, her thoughts swirling with uncertainty. The trailer park was a world away from the polished neighborhoods Claire was used to. Rusting trailers lined the narrow dirt roads, their exteriors battered by years of wear. Children played in the dusty yards, their laughter carrying through the air, while an old dog lounged on a porch, lazily wagging its tail. Claire felt out of place as she parked her sleek electric car. She spotted Tom's truck near a small weathered trailer and approached cautiously. Tom was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee in his hands. He looked up as she neared, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone neutral but tinged with surprise. I wanted to talk," Claire said, feeling small under his gaze. "I think I owe you an apology." Tom raised an eyebrow. "For what? Telling me my truck's killing the planet?" Claire winced. "For judging you without knowing your story." Tom studied her for a moment, then gestured to the empty chair beside him. "All right, you want to hear my story? Sit down." Claire sat, her heart pounding. Tom took a slow sip of his coffee and stared out at the horizon. "That truck," he began, his voice steady but tinged with sorrow, "used to belong to my son." Claire's heart sank. She hadn't expected this. Tom's voice was calm, but there was a weight behind every word that made her chest tighten. Mark, my boy, was my pride and joy, Tom continued. Smart kid, full of life. He loved that truck. Bought it with his own money when he turned 18. We spent hours fixing it up together. What happened to him? Claire asked softly. Tom's hands tightened around his coffee cup. He joined the military, he said after a pause. Wanted to serve his country, just like I did. But he didn't come back. Claire's throat tightened. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice trembling. Tom nodded slowly. After he died, that truck was all I had left of him, he said. It's not just a vehicle. It's a memory, a connection to my son. I can't afford a new car, sure, but even if I could, I wouldn't give it up. Claire sat in silence, guilt washing over her. She had been so quick to judge him, so eager to impose her beliefs without ever considering the pain he might be carrying. I shouldn't have spoken to you the way I did, she said finally. I didn't know. Tom shrugged. Most people don't. They see an old man with an old truck and make assumptions. It's the way the world works. They sat quietly for a moment, the sounds of children playing and the rustle of leaves filling the silence. Finally, Claire spoke again. I want to help, she said earnestly. I don't know how, but if there's anything I can do. Tom looked at her, his expression softening slightly. You want to help? Start by listening, he said. Not just to me, but to anyone carrying burdens you can't see. People like me don't need judgment. We need understanding. Claire nodded, his words sinking deep. She had always seen herself as someone who stood up for what was right, but now she realized that sometimes doing the right thing meant listening instead of speaking. As she left the trailer park, Claire felt something shift within her. She didn't know where this new path would lead, but she was determined to follow it. The days after Claire's visit to Tom were marked by an unfamiliar sense of self-reflection. She couldn't stop thinking about their conversation and the weight of his words. It was like a door had opened, revealing a world she had chosen to ignore. A world filled with people carrying invisible burdens. Tom's story stayed with her, making her question how often she had judged others without truly understanding them. Claire decided she needed to do more than just reflect. She needed to act. She began researching ways to support veterans, particularly those who might be struggling like Tom. It was during one of these late-night searches that she stumbled upon a local community group dedicated to helping veterans with everything from housing to vehicle repairs. Intrigued, Claire contacted the group, explaining that she knew someone who might benefit from their services. She didn't mention Tom by name, not wanting to overstep, but the group agreed to provide her with resources and information. 2 days later, Claire returned to the trailer park with a renewed sense of purpose. This time, she carried a small notebook filled with information she had gathered about resources for veterans. She also brought a box of coffee and donuts, hoping to break the ice. As she approached Tom's trailer, she felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. Tom was on the porch again, this time working on what looked like a worn-out radio. He glanced up as she walked closer, raising an eyebrow. "You're back," he said, his tone neutral. "I brought coffee," Claire said, holding up the box, "and donuts." Tom's expression softened slightly, though he didn't smile. "Well, I can't say no to coffee," he said, setting the radio aside. "Come on up." Claire climbed the steps to the porch and set the box on the small table beside Tom's chair. He poured himself a cup of coffee and took a sip before speaking again. "So, what brings you here this time?" "I've been thinking about what you said," Claire began. "About listening and understanding. I realized you're right. I don't know what it's like to walk in your shoes, but I want to try. And I want to help." Tom looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Help how?" he asked after a moment. Claire hesitated, then opened her notebook. "I found some organizations that help veterans with things like housing, job training, and even car repairs. I thought maybe one of them could help you with your truck or anything else you might need." Tom leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You did all this research for me?" he asked, his tone skeptical. Claire nodded. "I know I can't change what you've been through, but maybe I can make things a little easier." Tom was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Finally, he spoke. "You've got a good heart, Claire," he said, "but I've been doing things on my own for a long time. It's not easy for me to accept help." "I understand," Claire said quickly, "but these resources are here for people like you, people who've given so much and deserve support. You don't have to do everything alone." Tom sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "That's all I can promise." "That's all I'm asking," Claire said, smiling. She took a sip of her coffee, feeling a small sense of victory. They sat in silence for a while, the warm sun casting long shadows across the porch. Claire noticed the small details of Tom's home: the rusting mailbox, the potted plant struggling to survive in the corner, the faded American flag hanging by the door. Each detail told a story, and for the first time, Claire felt like she was beginning to understand. "Why do you care so much?" Tom asked suddenly, breaking the silence. The question caught Claire off guard. She took a moment to think before answering. "Because I've spent so much of my life focusing on what I thought was right," she said. "But I never stopped to think about the people I was judging. Meeting you made me realize how much I've been missing." Tom nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "Most people don't bother to look past the surface," he said. "It's easier to judge than to understand." Claire didn't respond, but his words stayed with her. She realized that this wasn't just about helping Tom, it was about changing herself, becoming someone who could truly make a difference. As the afternoon wore on, Claire and Tom talked about everything from the weather to Tom's memories of his son. Each story he shared painted a picture of a man who had endured more than his fair share of loss, but still found ways to keep going. Claire found herself admiring his resilience and quietly wondering if she could ever be as strong. When it was time to leave, Claire packed up her notebook but left the coffee and donuts. "I'll be back," she said, smiling as she stepped off the porch. Tom watched her go, his expression softer than before. "You're stubborn," he said, almost to himself, "but maybe that's not such a bad thing." As Claire drove away, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about making amends, it was about learning to be better. And for the first time, she felt like she was on the right path. Claire's visits to Tom became a routine over the next few weeks. At first, he seemed reluctant to let her in, but her persistence wore him down. They developed an unlikely friendship, with Claire bringing coffee and Tom sharing stories of his past. She listened intently, realizing how much she had overlooked about people like him. His stories were filled with equal parts heartbreak and resilience, and they began to change the way Claire saw the world. One afternoon, Claire arrived at the trailer park to find Tom working under the hood of his truck. The old vehicle groaned as he tinkered with its engine, his hands stained with grease. "Need some help?" Claire called out, stepping closer. Tom glanced at her and shook his head. "Unless you're a mechanic, I doubt it," he said with a wry smile. "I'm not," Claire admitted, "but I can hold tools and pass them to you." Tom chuckled and gestured for her to join him. "Suit yourself," he said. "Just don't blame me if you get your hands dirty." Claire spent the afternoon handing Tom wrenches and screwdrivers, watching as he worked on the truck with practiced precision. She noticed the way his hands moved, steady and deliberate, despite the tremor that sometimes made them shake. It was clear the truck wasn't just a vehicle to him, it was a labor of love, a connection to his son. As the sun began to set, Tom wiped his hands on a rag and leaned against the truck. "You know," he said, "this old thing might not look like much, but it's got a lot of life left in it. Kind of like me." Claire smiled. "I believe it," she said, "but you don't have to do everything alone. There are people who want to help." Tom sighed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I've spent most of my life taking care of myself," he said. "Relying on others doesn't come easy." "I get that," Claire said, "but letting people in doesn't make you weak. It takes strength to accept help." Tom didn't respond right away, but Claire could see the wheels turning in his mind. Finally, he nodded. "Maybe you're right," he said. "I'll think about it." The following week, Claire convinced Tom to let her contact one of the veteran support organizations she had researched. She explained that they could help with repairs for his truck, as well as other services he might need. Reluctantly, Tom agreed, and Claire made the call. The organization responded quickly, sending a team to assess the truck's condition. Claire was there when they arrived, watching as the mechanics examined the vehicle and took notes. Tom stood nearby, his arms crossed, looking both skeptical and hopeful. After the assessment, one of the mechanics approached Tom. "We can fix her up," he said, patting the truck's hood. "It'll take some time, but we'll get her running like new." Tom nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said quietly. As the weeks passed, the organization not only repaired the truck but also connected Tom with other resources, including a support group for veterans. Claire accompanied him to one of the meetings, sitting quietly as the men and women shared their stories. It was an eye-opening experience for her, one that deepened her understanding of the challenges veterans faced. After the meeting, Tom turned to Claire. "You didn't have to come," he said. "I wanted to," Claire replied. "I'm learning a lot just by being here." Tom smiled, a rare expression that softened his weathered face. "You've got a good heart," he said. "I don't say that lightly." Claire felt a warmth spread through her chest. For the first time, she felt like she was truly making a difference, not just in Tom's life, but in her own. She realized that her journey with him was about more than redemption. It was about growth and connection. As the truck repairs neared completion, the organization planned a small celebration to mark the occasion. Claire helped organize the event, bringing together members of the community to show their support for Tom. On the day of the celebration, the repaired truck was unveiled, its once rusted exterior gleaming with fresh paint. Tom stood by the truck, his hand resting on the hood. "She looks good," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She looks amazing," Claire agreed, "and so do you." Tom chuckled, shaking his head. "You're something else, Claire," he said. "I don't know what I did to deserve all this, but I'm grateful." "You deserve it," Claire said firmly, "and don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As the celebration continued, Claire watched as Tom interacted with the crowd. For the first time, he seemed at ease, his usual guarded demeanor replaced with a quiet confidence. It was a moment Claire knew she would never forget. That night, as she drove home, Claire reflected on how much had changed since the day she confronted Tom at the gas station. What had started as a clash of ideals had transformed into a journey of understanding and friendship. She realized that Tom had taught her more than she could ever teach him, about resilience, about compassion, and about the power of truly seeing people for who they were. Claire smiled to herself, feeling a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in years. This wasn't the end of the journey. It was just the beginning. The celebration for Tom's truck had been a turning point, not just for Tom, but for Claire as well. The community had rallied around him, and it was clear that his story had touched more people than he could have imagined. Yet, for Claire, the work wasn't done. She had become deeply invested in making a difference, not only for Tom, but for others like him. One evening, as Claire was organizing her notes on veteran resources, she received a call from Tom. It was rare for him to reach out directly, so she immediately picked up. "Hey, Tom," she said. "What's up?" There was a pause on the other end before Tom spoke. "Claire, I need a favor," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Of course. What do you need?" Claire asked, already reaching for her notebook. "It's about the veterans group," Tom said. "There's a guy there, Jim. He's in a rough spot, worse than me. Lost his job, and his landlord's threatening to kick him out. I was wondering if you could help him like you helped me." Claire's heart tightened. She had never heard Tom ask for help on someone else's behalf before. "Of course," she said. "Give me his number and I'll see what I can do." The next day, Claire met Jim at a small diner near his apartment. He was a tall, wiry man in his 50s, with tired eyes and a forced smile. Over coffee, he told her about his struggles, how he had been laid off, how he couldn't afford his rent, and how the stress was taking a toll on his health. Claire listened intently, taking detailed notes and promising to do whatever she could. By the end of the week, Claire had connected Jim with a housing program for veterans, as well as a job training initiative. She even rallied some of her friends to help him move into temporary housing while his situation stabilized. Jim was overwhelmed by her kindness, and when he thanked her, Claire felt a familiar warmth, the same feeling she had when she saw Tom smile for the first time. Word of Claire's efforts began to spread among the veterans group. Soon, other members started reaching out to her, asking for advice or connections to resources. Claire found herself busier than ever, but she didn't mind. For the first time, she felt like her work had real meaning. One evening, as she was wrapping up a call with another veteran in need, she received a text from Tom. "You're making a difference, kid. Proud of you." Claire smiled, tears welling up in her eyes. She hadn't realized how much Tom's approval meant to her until that moment. As the weeks turned into months, Claire's work expanded beyond the veterans group. She began collaborating with local organizations, advocating for better policies, and even organizing fundraisers. Her faceless YouTube channel, once focused on impersonal issues, transformed into a platform for sharing real stories. Stories like Tom's, Jim's, and countless others who deserved to be heard. One day, Tom surprised Claire by agreeing to appear in one of her videos. It had taken weeks of convincing, but he finally agreed to sit down and share his story on camera. The video quickly went viral, with thousands of viewers commenting on Tom's resilience and Claire's dedication. "I never thought I'd be a YouTube star," Tom joked as they read through the comments together. "You're not a star," Claire teased. "You're a legend." Tom laughed, but there was a seriousness in his eyes as he turned to Claire. "You've got a gift," he said. "You see people, not just what they show on the surface, but who they really are. Don't lose that." "I won't," Claire promised, and she meant it. As her channel grew, Claire used her platform to highlight the struggles and triumphs of others. She shared stories of veterans, single parents, immigrants, and anyone else whose voices needed to be amplified. Her work became a movement, inspiring others to look beyond stereotypes and see the humanity in everyone. But even as her reach expanded, Claire never forgot where it all started. She continued visiting Tom, who had become not just a friend, but a mentor. Together, they brainstormed new ways to help their community, from organizing food drives to creating a mentorship program for at-risk youth. One afternoon, as they sat on Tom's porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Tom turned to Claire. "You know," he said, "you've changed a lot since the day we met." Claire chuckled. "You mean, since I yelled at you at the gas station?" Tom smiled. "Yeah, since then. You're not the same person." "I hope not," Claire said. "I've learned a lot from you, Tom. More than I can ever repay." Tom shook his head. "You don't owe me anything, Claire. You've done more for me than I ever could have asked for." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the sound of crickets filling the air. Claire felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that her journey was far from over but that she was exactly where she needed to be. She reached into her bag and handed Tom a notebook filled with ideas for future projects. "This is just the beginning," she said. Tom opened the notebook and skimmed through it, nodding appreciatively. "You're unstoppable, aren't you?" he said with a smile. Claire grinned. "I try." Months had passed since the day Claire first met Tom at the gas station. What had begun as a confrontation had transformed into a journey of connection and change. Claire's work had grown far beyond what she could have imagined, but so had her understanding of the world and herself. Still, she often returned to Tom's porch, where their conversations reminded her of why she had started this journey in the first place. One crisp autumn afternoon, Claire arrived at Tom's trailer with a box of fresh pastries. The leaves had turned shades of gold and red, and the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke. Tom was sitting on the porch whittling a small block of wood into what looked like a miniature truck. "Hey, Tom," Claire called out as she walked up the steps. "I brought your favorite, apple turnovers." Tom looked up and smiled, setting the carving aside. "You know the way to an old man's heart," he said, accepting the box. Claire sat down beside him, watching as he opened the box and took a bite. "How's the carving coming along?" she asked, nodding toward the wooden truck. Tom chuckled. "Slowly, but it's getting there. Thought I'd make something for the kids at the youth center." Claire's heart warmed at the thought. The mentorship program they had started for at-risk youth had been one of their proudest achievements. Tom had taken to it with surprising enthusiasm, spending hours teaching the kids woodworking and basic mechanics. "They're going to love it," Claire said. They sat in companionable silence for a while. Finally, Tom broke the quiet. "You've done a lot, Claire. More than most people would have thought possible." Claire shrugged, a small smile on her lips. "I had good inspiration," she said, "and a great mentor." Tom laughed softly. "You give me too much credit," he said. "All I did was tell you a few stories." "You did more than that," Claire said, her tone serious. "You made me see things differently. You reminded me that everyone has a story worth hearing." Tom nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And you made me realize it's okay to let people in," he said, "that it's okay to accept help." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Claire turned to see Jim stepping out, carrying a bag of tools. He waved as he approached. "Hey, you two," he called out. "Thought I'd stop by and see if Tom needed any help with his project." "Always room for an extra pair of hands," Tom said, standing up and shaking Jim's hand. The three of them spent the afternoon working on the wooden truck and chatting about their plans for the next community event. Claire felt a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced in a long time. These people, this work, it all felt like home. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Claire leaned back in her chair and watched as Tom and Jim continued working. She thought about how much had changed since that day at the gas station. She had found a purpose, a community, and a deeper understanding of what it meant to truly see and care for others. Before she left that evening, Tom handed her the finished wooden truck. "For you," he said, a reminder of where it all started. Claire held the small carving in her hands, her eyes glistening. "Thank you, Tom," she said, "for everything." Tom nodded, his voice soft. "No, Claire. Thank you." The days that followed were busy, with Claire organizing a community event to celebrate the mentorship program's success. Tom played an active role, recruiting volunteers and teaching kids how to build small projects for display. The event grew larger than Claire had anticipated, drawing people from neighboring towns who wanted to see what the program had achieved. On the day of the event, the community center buzzed with activity. Claire walked through the crowd, greeting attendees and checking on the booths. Tom stood near the entrance, proudly showcasing the wooden trucks the kids had made. Claire watched as he interacted with visitors, his once guarded demeanor now replaced with warmth and openness. "You've come a long way," Claire said as she joined him at the booth. Tom smiled. "We both have," he said, "and we're just getting started." The event was a resounding success, raising funds and awareness for the mentorship program. As the evening wound down, Claire and Tom sat on the steps of the community center, watching the last attendees leave. "You know," Tom said, "I used to think my best days were behind me. But this, everything we've done, it feels like the start of something new." Claire nodded, her heart full. "It is," she said, "and I'm glad we're doing it together." The wooden truck Tom had given her now sat on her desk, a reminder of how far they had come. It wasn't just a symbol of their friendship. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when people chose to see each other for who they truly were. As Claire looked up at the stars that night, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known before. This was just the beginning, and she couldn't wait to see what came next.